If you can visualize that this is how much CO2 you're burning when you're not actually utilizing your code or your environments, it's not my wallet, but it's my planet. And I think that's probably the best motivator you can have.
Hello everyone, welcome to Green.io, the podcast for responsible technologists building a greener digital world, one bite at a time. On Green.io, we explore how to reduce the environmental impact of our digital world. Our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. More than 99% of organizations worldwide use at least one software as a service solution. According to Gartner, cloud application service, so strictly speaking, software as a service, not mentioning infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, so SaaS is expected to grow above the $200 billion milestone in 2024. One of the largest market capitalizations worldwide are SaaS providers like Adobe, Shopify, Zoom, and Salesforce. Several are communicating intensively on their sustainability commitments, and more specifically on their green IT strategy. But how can you achieve impactful results when most of the decisions are made by your customers? How do you help your clients using your software in a more sustainable way? Now, I have to admit this episode was a bit of a stretch in terms of scheduling. Tereze Gaile is based in Wellington, New Zealand, and Niklas Sundberg lives in Stockholm, Sweden, 10 hours of time difference and a 17,400 kilometer journey. Well, that was worth the effort because this dialogue is a great opportunity to get actionable feedback from two experts in the field of sustainable IT, especially for software companies. Niklas and Tereze have a lot to share about it. Their experience might be different, but they also share quite a lot in common. Both are authors, Niklas having recently published Sustainable IT Playbook for Technology Leaders, and Tereze being the lead author of the Sustainability Guide for Salesforce Technology. Both are doers. Tereze is a technical architect at MuleSoft, a Salesforce company, and she is also its global sustainability SME. Niklas is a senior president and chief information officer at ASSA ABLOY Global Solution Division. And both are sustainability advocates within the organization as well as in NGO and professional groups. So I would dare to describe them also as activists in a suit, borrowing this expression from Rainer Karcher, the global head of sustainability at Allianz. Welcome, Tereze. Welcome, Niklas. Thanks a lot for joining Green.io today.
Kia ora. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Gaël.
Oh, Chiara, that reminds me some wonderful time in New Zealand where when I was hiking and meeting wonderful people. Thanks a lot for this, Tereze. Hi, Niklas.
Hi, happy to be here. Looking forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, we're looking for it too. I'd like to start with my usual question about your journey towards sustainability. So how did you become interested in sustainability and maybe IT sustainability? Tereze, would you like to share a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So I've always had a strong affinity for nature. So I grew up on a farm on the border of Latvia and Estonia. So I was always quite blessed and privileged to have the wildlife literally on my doorstep. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I moved to the beautiful Aotearoa, New Zealand, is for its incredibly unique fauna and flora. But I think the penny drop moment for me was when I started thinking about how I can make the most impact. And I came to the realization that's probably through being a change agent, if you will, within a big organization like Salesforce. Because I felt no matter what I do in my personal life, I could fly less, I could, watch when, eating less meat or, recycling, etc., etc. I just had this feeling that that's not enough. So what more can I do to move the needle? And pretty much from joining Salesforce, the very first thing that I did with MuleSoft is I wrote a blog on sustainable engineering practices with MuleSoft. Very humble beginnings. It was just, didn't get a big splash or anything, but this was 2.5 years ago, and since then, we've come a long way.
Well, that's funny because there is this great debate, especially among young engineers, whether they're software engineers or engineers in pretty much everything, or graduates, that shall I quit, shall I leave the regular big corporation world to make an impact and join an NGO, etc. And obviously, we need a lot of those great people in NGO, but that's also true. I remember, I think it was Antoine Monin, Alexandre Monin, who told us in a conference recently, do not quit, do not leave. We need, change makers within big organization, because if everyone leaves, that will be a terrible issues to move the needle, as you said. So I guess you're part of the one who will make the change within organization. Am I right?
Exactly. At least I try to.
Yeah, you can try, and after a while, if it doesn't move the needle that much, then then you've got a free pass to try something else.
Exactly.
Exactly. And the second thought I just popped in my mind is, you had as you say, the nature on your doorstep, and that connects with something I read very recently. When you assess how much animals can be spotted in Walt Disney movies as a proxy for how much kids are exposed to nature in cultural contents, there is a dramatic reduction, like something from several dozens in early 50s and 60s movies to one or two animals. That's pretty much it in other more recent movie like Aladdin, or it's not that recent, but anyway. And that really resonates because not always my daughter, I'm like, I need to expose her a lot to nature and a lot to, movies or whatever TV show with nature, because that is actually the very best way to having people that are aware, just being connected to nature, which is not that easy in cities. And what about you, Niklas?
Very similar story, I would say. What I love about technology is the impact you can have on a global scale. And like Tereze was saying, is that yes, you can do a lot of things in your personal life, getting closer to nature, living more sustainably, and so forth. But if you really want to move the needle, make an impact, you need to apply it into your corporate setting. And fortunately, in my role, I was also tasked to create a sustainable IT strategy as part of our overall enterprise sustainability strategy. And this is about 2 years ago. And as I started researching into the number of areas, I had a lot of revelations in terms of the impact of tech and IT here and now, but also what lies ahead in the next 7 or 8 years to 2030. And that sort of had the revelation for me to put together a playbook based on my own learnings, based on our own findings, our own journey within my company that I work for. And that turned out to be a playbook for technology leaders to apply in their everyday life. And I really want to make something that's very hands-on, very tangible, something that you can really pick up, read a few chapters, and then you can start applying it into your business environment. So that was the whole idea, to empower, to inspire, and to activate people to get started. Because I think we have a big knowledge gap in terms of the impact of tech on climate change.
Absolutely. And actually, we're going to use your book during this podcast episode, and we're going to start in two questions, because I would love to ask Tereze first about her journey writing the book in Salesforce, and how Salesforce and MuleSoft, obviously, but the entire Salesforce company is moving toward being more sustainable regarding its software practices. Because the focus of this episode is really sustainability in software companies or departments building software. So Tereze, you've got a unique viewpoint, and I would love you to share with us how and why your company recently released this sustainable IT playbook. And I would love then, Niklas, to. I will come back to especially one chapter in Niklas' book a bit later. But Tereze, if you could start, that would be great. If you could explain us a bit why this book, why released, and what has been achieved so far at Salesforce and or MuleSoft.
Of course. I think before I jump into how the guide itself came about, I just want to spend a moment or so just covering the fact that sustainability is actually one of our core values. And I think given that it's embedded essentially in the organization, it made it a lot easier to get support from leadership and to influence internally. So, in terms of that initial journey that I alluded to initially, I just wrote a very humble little blog on sustainable engineering practices, but that over time snowballed into being connected with the core sustainability team. That's like, look, we love this. How do we elevate it? What more can we do? Then being connected across different leaders across technology and product organization as well. And they're saying, look, we're working with AWS on the sustainability pillar, and we're trying to do this. And it's like, how do we marry all of those things up and really combine it all together? So I think it was a real mammoth group effort, to be absolutely honest. We had some product managers, for example, who had already put some ideas around. So, for example, if you're creating products or services, what kind of principles do you need to think about? So, for example, even things like a web page, how long does it take to load? Like how heavy are the graphics? Things like that. So it was really the whole initiative span from, okay, we're starting to raise that collective awareness internally, but how can we really make it really polished and share it with the world, share it with our hundreds of thousands of customers that we have, and take them on that journey. um, Needless to say, I'm sure Nicholas had a similar experience, but it went through many rounds of reviews and there's so many different feedback and ideas. So I think the tricky bit was actually how do we still make it true and useful, but also not letting perfection get in the way of progress. So really, this guide for us, it's a conversation starter. By no means is it perfect. It's just to raise that awareness. It has practices across architecture, design, architecture, development, and operations. And the idea is to give a couple of really practical examples of what you can do across the software development lifecycle to reduce the impact of using our products. So I think in terms of what resonates the most, and it was always a surprise to me, the majority of time we speak to customers, they're completely oblivious that technology, of course, has an impact. You see these very polished products, but actually they are hosted somewhere on a data center. And just even using statistics like, well, data centers actually emit more than the aviation sector, which is often quoted. And you just see the penny drop because they realize they have a huge footprint with our products. And then like, well, what do we do? Like, how does it tie to our sustainability strategy? So just as one example, I can speak a lot to from a MuleSoft angle because that's what I've worked with organizations on. So one thing, and I think this is maybe a little bit different to what's been covered in the past, is also looking at API reusability and what's the impact of that, not just from a technology perspective, but also in developer productivity. So piece of work that we did recently covered, let's look at it more holistically, not just the tech as well, but actually how, the human element. If you don't need uh, 3 times more project teams to create this because you're already thinking about reuse and having it, creating all these composable little building blocks that you can leverage for future projects, you're actually, the human aspect in terms of emission saving is also, you should not ignore. And for others, it's just learning that organizations often have their sandbox environments completely unchecked. So there's applications that are running, burning resources in the cloud. So it's like, hey, if you had really good governance around decommissioning APIs or applications when they're no longer required, and actually having numbers or a process. So as another example, Salesforce has these demo organizations, or you can spin them up quickly, but they expire after a certain period of time. So then, it takes away the problem of, I need to now go do some work and decommission it. So yeah, those I would say a couple examples that usually get people to, really like understand how impactful it can be.
So you take seriously the issue with cloud zombies, to
Yeah,
to,
exactly.
to quote Anne Curie. I love her expression about this. I can imagine like zombie hunters. um, and Niklas, I reckon you dedicated a full chapter to software, which is quoting you one of the fundamental building blocks of sustainable IT practices. Just don't remember if there are 5 or 6 in your book, but you will update us on this. Does what Tereze just described resonate with you, especially focusing on software and SaaS providers?
Yes, absolutely. I think, like Therese was saying, the first and foremost principle when it comes to software development is to relocate. I usually talk about 3R principle in terms of relocate, re-architect, and right size the application. So by putting the container or the workload that you want to run in a low carbon area, that's going to have a big impact, obviously. But then obviously zombie loads is important to reduce, shut down your test beds, your automated testing and so forth when you're not working on it, for example. And to really try to visualize it, to put the power in the hands of the software engineers so that this doesn't become an activity that you do once a year just because you need to calculate your carbon footprint, rather than giving a dashboard to the software engineers where they can actually see in real time what is the energy consumption, what is the carbon emission on their code, on their different environments, and so forth, to really, create that engagement all through the organization. To have that instant feedback, I think is really, really important when it comes to software development.
And this instant feedback approach, does it connect to your sustainable SDLC practices, or is it something different?
We are exploring in terms of how we can utilize it in the best way to bring awareness into this, because just like Therese was saying, the awareness is not there, and it requires a bit of awareness, education in order to bring this to the table. As a software engineer, you're obviously tasked to bring products and solutions to market quickly. So I think it's also important to embed this into the software development lifecycle, and not make this as a separate thing that you need to do in isolation. This should be embedded into the software development lifecycle rather than doing it in isolation. So making it as easy and consumable as possible, I think it's really, really key. And I think we will see a lot more of these type of tools surfacing in the near future, that you can connect to both on-premise environments, but also obviously cloud providers like Amazon, Google, and so forth.
Yeah, there are some work being done at Kubernetes level in the Kubernetes community, for instance, to get instantaneous carbon footprint using it, and kind of incorporating in your CI/CD pipeline the carbon footprint of your code. But I'm always wondering, but both of you're hands-on people, huh? So you do it for real in real life all the time. And how much do you believe this automation that is kind of the best possible outcome? Because this is, as you said, you need to make it very visual. You need to make it available all the time, and not something, some kind of yearly committee where everyone gets nervous 2 days before and forget about it. So having it automated in your CI/CD is a great achievement, but is it really doable? And could you share any examples where it has actually worked, or is it too early stage at the moment?
No, we can definitely say that I think if you incentivize and you tell your software engineers that, shut down your cloud environments over the weekend or when you go home from work, because we want to save cost, that's not really a great motivator. But if you can visualize that this is how much CO2 you're burning when you're not actually utilizing your code or your environments, then I think that's the best motivator. And I have a colleague, Elsa Westin. She says that it's not my wallet, but it's my planet. And I think that's probably the best motivator you can have to really visualize it and show. And we've seen that this really works, that people are actually taking this serious and decommissioning resources more readily than they usually do.
It's not my wallet, but it's my planet. I really love it. Tereze, is it like integrating in CI/CD pipeline at MuleSoft or Salesforce? Is it something that you've already done, or how do you enable or empowered, I would say, your developers to make the best possible decisions?
So I have two things to say here. I'll start with a custom example, and this echoes what Niklas was saying. If there's really demand and desire, developers can move really, really quickly. So, for example, I was working with a large bank based out of India, and initially they said, "Look, we're starting our green computing journey. Really curious to know what MuleSoft's point of view is. What data can you expose, or what can you how can you help us shape our strategy?" And then the next time I checked in with them, they were using green algorithms. They had integrated it with their CI/CD pipelines. They already had dashboards set up. They're like, "Look, we can see the emissions per API, per environment." And now we're essentially collaborating. Okay, this is awesome. You've essentially created your baseline. You can track and you can actually see, what's the impact of each respective action. So going through identifying those greenhouse gas emissions opportunities from both architecture, both from operational perspective and so forth. So that's really exciting. I think that's the first thing. Like, there are tools, and if you have backing and you really want to do that, you can go really fast and it can be really, really amazing. The other thing is, we fully acknowledge that we need to be transparent with our data, and we're really actively working on how do we expose that data through the UI, or so that then you can programmatically retrieve it via our platform APIs. So there's work being done on our core platform. So for CRM, it's not officially released, but it's essentially in the works. So I've seen a couple of demos, or just had to play around with it. But it's really, really fascinating because it actually shows you for different Apex classes what are the carbon emissions, for your different components that you've configured, the front end or more back end if it's called, making calls to back end systems, and it exposes all of that out of the user interface, which is really, really powerful. Which is the biggest thing customers constantly ask us for, and it's something that we're like, there's demand for it, and we have to do our part in making sure that data is available, so they can also start making better informed choices. Because the minute they can see what the what the emissions are, and starting to understand what that actually means, that they will want to do something about it. So that's the first thing that we're focusing on.
Well, I've got a bit of a dilemma now because the two examples you gave, I would like to dig a bit deeper. So let's park for the moment your great example with this bank in India, because I wanted to connect next about which kind of support they got from their leadership level. And I know that there are not the full chapter in Niklas' book about it as well. So let's park this for a moment and let's go to this data question, because that's something that I hear over and over among my guests here in the podcast and people I work with, for instance, in the climate action tech community or Boa Vista, that, data is not here, data is not transparent, data is only scope 1 or scope 2. How much do you know, and how much, Tereze, do you believe that Salesforce, or maybe only MuleSoft, you tell us, would be able to provide open and checkable data, including scope 3? And how much can you put pressure on your own suppliers? Because as I recall, Niklas, just quoting it by heart, but there is something in your book about leveraging your purchasing power or something like that. So I'd love both of you to comment. Maybe Tereze, if you can start first on what is your ambition with data so far?
Great question. It's always a little bit prickly, isn't it, when it comes to data? But no, that's why it's important to talk about it. So I guess first thing to mention here is MuleSoft is built on Amazon Web Services. So actually, we have been working very closely with AWS and pushing them to share more data and be more transparent, because of course, you know, we put our products on their infrastructure, so it's another layer. So from a customer perspective, there's like layers and layers, and it can become very tricky then to try and calculate what their emissions are, and that's progressing. So I know that pressure, and I know it's been talked about in previous podcasts as well, but that's 100% our strategy. And me being in the customer success organization, I'm always educating the customer to say, put pressure on us, because that's how we shape the product roadmap. The minute we have every customer demanding this, it will be there. So I'm essentially also a customer advocate in that regard, because I show them the art of the possible, but also say, look, sustainability is important for any large organization. I start asking the questions how, as part of your 2030 strategy, you also want to reduce scope 3 emissions, which is purchased goods and services, which means us. So, I sort of plant the seed, because that also helps us get more momentum in how many resources we can put on to expose that data. While we're working all of that out in terms of, okay, so what's the method? How much can we share? There are other ways at the moment that I've used to help customers at least get a really good ballpark figure, because often the best that you can typically get from a vendor is, let's look at how much you spend with us, and that spend proportion is your emissions out of our entire emissions, right? It's like a spend-based allocation method. And for most organizations, that's just not good enough. It's not granular enough. So then using a third-party API that, so for example, ThoughtWorks kind of framework, we can actually reasonably well go back and, okay, so you're hosting your MuleSoft integrations and APIs in this region on this kind of worker. The CPU is roughly this. Like, that's enough input for me to actually work out what those emissions are. And then it's granular enough also to track, if they do something, what's the impact. And that's actually something we're doing with a couple of large organizations. And the reason why it's so important is, if we have those success stories, we can go back in and say, look, this is what, the impact you can have, and we need to amplify it.
Yeah, Tereze, when I'm listening to you, I always feel a bit schizophrenic, because when I listen to you, I'm like, oh, great, there are this great doers inside big corporation pushing and basically raising awareness in departments, in companies, where the simple idea that your software or your data centers are actually an issue, an environmental issue, is something that is not here at all. Or that's great, etc., etc. And then I made this very, hands-on activist who are already talking about scope 3, about, we need also to pay attention to resources and not only carbon, and we need to have way more information from big cloud providers, especially AWS, which is not the number one at the moment in their wish list, I would say, because it's not only the carbon which is emitted by the energy you use, but also the quite significant carbon footprint when you build a hardware, and you've got even other issue with water usage, etc., etc. So I feel always a bit schizophrenic. So Niklas, can you be my shrink here and helping me, with all the different experiences you've got, and there's also your very important role in sustainableIT.org. Are we getting better? Is it bad, doctor?
Well, I think, if we take the doctor example, I think we're all starting to come to a realization that the patient is sick, and in this in this perspective, it's the planet that we need to create a medicine or come up with a remedy for. I think also, as I state in my book, is that no one has all of the answers. I think this needs to be a very collaborative approach between technology leaders like myself, sitting on the buyer side, but also working with the vendors like Salesforce, ServiceNow, Microsoft, and what have you. I think it's really, really important that transparency is key, because if you're not going to have transparency, I think a lot of companies are going to be doomed, to be honest. So it's rather better to have an approach saying that we are working on it, we don't have all of the answers, these are the assumptions, this is how we're trying to work it out. Because we also have emerging legislations in Europe, for example, with the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that by 2024, 2025, you need to start reporting on your full scope 1, scope 2, and also your scope 3. So these tough questions needs to happen, and it's just a matter of months and less than a year where we need to start getting these type of data points from vendors. And I think that will probably be enough to start driving impact, because as we sort of discussed in the beginning of the podcast, as technology leaders, when we put in something into motion, we do it on a global scale, and it has a massive impact if you do it right from the beginning. So I'm very confident that once we sort of have an established baseline, I've seen examples where you can reduce your CO2 emissions by 2/3 quite rapidly if you use some well-equipped levers to do so.
That's always something that I love to ask. What is kind of the top actions or the top tips that you could share that are workable pretty much everywhere in every company? And what are the actions which are more specific to each company? So obviously you cannot list all of them, but more like, okay, if you want to start and achieve these very successful results in a matter of months or years, whatever, what you should start looking at pretty much in any companies, and what is usually a bit more company specific?
Yeah, so we already discussed cloud and the impact that it can have by choosing the right location and the right provider. Software development is obviously one key, but then also in my role as a CIO, you're usually managing thousands of applications, and having a good application portfolio management around those. And this is the great thing about that, you're not only going to reduce your CO2 footprint by rationalizing your applications and moving things to the cloud and migrating things and removing legacy applications, but you also, there's a very compelling IT cost reduction built into that. So you have sustainability, you have IT cost reduction working alongside together. So application rationalization on a bigger scale is quite important to work with as a CIO, as a CTO. One thing that we haven't mentioned is the embodied carbon, for example. And when I mean embodied carbon, I talk about all of the hardware that you procure, for example. Anything from your smartphone, your laptop, your servers, your network equipment, and so forth. And if we take some examples, for example, just an Apple iPhone 14 emits 70 kilos of CO2 over a 3-year life cycle. A typical Dell laptop off the shelf roughly emits 320 kilos over a 4-year life cycle. So I think also as consumers, as a consumer of IT, we need to make sure that we prolong the longevity of the hardware and make sure that we can find a second life and we can pass them on in the value chain by not only disposing them, but to work with a reputable partner that can give the asset a second life. They can refurbish it, they can repurpose it, they can take apart components and putting into new or old assets. And recycling should really be the last asset, to be honest. And from what I hear, talking to some of these vendors like Apple and Dell, is that we haven't really done a great job of creating circularity where these assets actually come back to them. Apple, for example, have created the robot Daisy, and they have them on a number of locations across the world. But from my understanding is that they only get back a very, very insignificant portion of the number of assets or number of smartphones, for example, that they are putting out there in the marketplace. So I think we also have a responsibility to make sure that we apply a more circular approach to this, to prolong the longevity of the assets, but also when they become end of use or end of life, then we make sure that we work with a solid partner that can provide us with a transparent supply chain, that can provide us with good data, and to make sure that the assets is being refurbished or recirculated.
So to sum it up, the three main culprits to investigate first, if I follow your ideas, will be carbon aware with your cloud location, rationalize your application and decommission as much as possible of them, and then be aware of the embedded carbon of your own devices and hardware, and make sure that you go full speed toward a circular economy or the circularity of it. Am I right?
Yes, for sure. And then to the fourth point is really to leverage your vendor ecosystem to start putting pressure on your vendors. So really leverage your buying power and work with the vendors that are serious about this. Look at the vendors, what type of commitments they have done, for example, and how they are working with it. And replace the vendors that are not serious about it, because there are a number of vendors that haven't really taken this seriously so far.
And so, Tereze, do you feel the pressure?
Well, as I joked earlier, I think we can always apply more pressure to really, really move the needle forward. But yes, similar to what Niklas said in terms of, choosing your suppliers, we actually do have something called a sustainability exhibit. And the whole idea behind that is to put climate commitments into our supplier contracts. The idea being, again, we want to take our suppliers on that journey and say, okay, do you have science-based targets? If not, we can share everything that we're doing to really knowledge share. Because at the end of the day, we only win if we all win, right? Like no one wins alone in preserving and saving the planet. The more people we can get on board, the better.
I mean, you started to explain that basically you do a great job educating your own customers. And actually that in a perfect world, that should be the opposite. So is there like different kind of customers or different locations? Like do you experience that you've got more pressure from customers based, I don't know, in Singapore or in the US rather than in other countries? And or is it mostly you who will actually raise awareness, explain that using Salesforce or MuleSoft has some environmental impact and that it should be aware of it? How does it go today?
The first battle was actually raising awareness internally, and really, bringing to light the impact. Because again, it's not just carbon, right? As Niklas mentioned, it's also, all of our devices need rare earth metals, so there's a myriad of different issues. But coming back to the question in terms of organizations that we work with and customers, there's a really fascinating trend. Whenever we do, maybe I speak at a community event or we do something with our developer community, all of a sudden the techie is like, oh, this is fascinating. I didn't realize this. And we're starting to see more and more demand in requests around, well, what can we do? Do you have any guidance? And then they want to partner up. So I do, it is a little bit of push and pull. So sort of also planting the seed. And you have to also remember, traditionally, the audience or the stakeholders from organizations that we work with tend to be your architects, developers, and so forth. So while these really mature, large organizations have a very mature sustainability or ESG um, department, the IT organization often has no idea, and those two departments are essentially in silos. So again, just through some of our work, we sometimes say, hey, your organization has these goals. How are you, working from an IT perspective? How does IT feed into the wider strategy? So that's again like how we influence and work with these large organizations to really, you know, make the penny drop and also show them what could be done and share some of the successes from other organizations.
And I would love to bounce back on what you say, because the strategy part is something that I'm facing more and more with my customers. You've got strategy for everything. You've got strategy for accessibility, you've got strategy for sustainability, you've got strategy for security, cybersecurity, etc., etc., and obviously strategy for marketing, product, blah blah blah. What would be your advice to incorporate a sustainable IT strategy in a in your corporation? Is it something that should be separated, connected with the sustainability strategy? If so, how? It shouldn't exist at all. It's a bit like a digital strategy today. That's a very wrong signal if you've got a digital strategy, because it means that the digitalization is not that advanced in your own company. So what would be your feedback on this, Tereze?
I don't think you can use a cookie cutter approach, frankly. I think it really does depend on what your organization, how it's structured, what your strategy is in the first place, and so forth. But what I've seen, at least with some of the organizations that we've recently partnered up with, is they have a very strong and clear idea what their goals are. So, for example, by 2030, they want to halve their carbon emissions. They also have strategies around, which sustainable development goals are a priority for them. And I've seen IT leaders look at that and say, okay, so looking at our current estates, how does that feed up? And even I'm starting to see some of the organizations that we speak to actually have sustainability as part of their IT strategy as well. So before it wasn't anywhere written down, and it's now formally captured. And as part of that, they might have different domains that they call out, so be it domain or applications or their cloud strategy. I think a part of that also echoes, seeing some of the hyperscalers having sustainability in their well architected frameworks. So it's just like really fascinating to see that formally being part of the IT strategy as well. But again, that's just a few examples I've seen. I know for others it's completely different. And yeah, so short answer, it really depends on the kind of organization.
Sure, but it helps to share some feedback nonetheless. And what about you, Niklas? Because it's a significant part of your book which is dedicated to strategy.
Well, I think it's important to first have an established baseline in terms of where you are and what are the levers that you can sort of pull in order to get to a desired state. I think the journey is obviously going to be different for different industries, for different companies, and so forth. But it's important to formulate that overall strategy, and similar to a digitalization strategy, it should be embedded into your overall business strategy or your IT strategy, and not be a standalone piece, but to embed it and to make it part of the DNA as we progress with this. So create a simple, actionable strategy that you can start with. It doesn't need to be something that's going to take you 6 months or 12 months to produce. It should be fairly simple. It should be action oriented. And you should have a number of key tangible areas, like we talked about data centers, for example, or cloud, how you reduce your embodied carbon with your end user computing, for example. How do you look at your application portfolio? So very, very tangible, and really a great strategy should really also single out a number of items that you shouldn't do, and really focus on the key things that are going to make the biggest impact for you.
So you're a big fan of the Moscow and especially the W, huh? What you won't do when you prioritize things.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing that we haven't really discussed in that much detail is dark data. And I think that's really something that's a bit concerning. I think going forward as well, is that there's so much data that we store, single-use data, and then we never to retrieve it again, for example. And this obviously comes into the space of AI, autonomous vehicles, and so forth, where we train different models. We need large data sets in order to be able to create a safe environment for autonomous vehicles and so forth. But I think it's equally important to make sure that we put good retention data in place for companies to make sure that the data doesn't just grow indefinitely. And there are some numbers around this that in this year, in last year, in 2022, we generated 97 zettabytes of data, and that's 97 trillion gigabytes of data. And by 2025, if we don't sort of break the curve or we change the way in terms of how we manage data, this will double to roughly 180 zettabytes, so 180 trillion gigabytes. So it's enormous amount of data, and we really need to reimagine the approach to how we manage data going forward.
Indeed. And you know, connecting with what we've discussed briefly earlier, which is that there are stuff beyond carbon. I always love to quote this study from Melvin Vopson about the material footprint of data, because if we continue at that space with the current technology, but Melvin Vopson made a very simple calculation, which is that under the current data growth, by 2000, I think it was 2047, we will have to excavate the size of the Mount Everest every year just to build the servers to store this data. So I guess this is where, as you said, like sustainable I-Street strategy meets data strategy, and especially data governance about deleting when you don't use it or do not creating it at the first place. There is something that we briefly mentioned for you, Niklas, with sustainableIT.org, and not at all with you, Tereze, but both of you, you shared how much it's important to work in teams, to work collaboratively, both within your companies, but also outside your companies. And both of you, you are very much involved in other activities, like I briefly mentioned NGO and stuff. Could you tell us why company today should not remain on their own when it comes to sustainability, and what are the commitments that you would like to highlight in your professional life?
I guess I can go first. So I think it goes without saying you can learn a lot, and I've been really inspired by the open source community, just the eagerness to collaborate, and one brain is better, two brains better than one. And also some of the problems that they're really, really complex when it comes to trying to figure out how do we solve it, because the systems have multiple layers or different components, and then you have networking, back end, front end. Very quickly it can get very, very complex. So, be it partnerships with universities, because I know Salesforce does that as well, in terms of, what is the most recent papers that have been published in space, what can we learn from that, but also giving back to the community as well, right? So how can we contribute to open source, or, really get people on board? I guess from my perspective, I've been involved quite heavily just, in terms of MuleSoft developer community. So again, this is everyone across our customers and partners and so forth. So again, just sharing things around the guide or what we're doing. But also, for example, Green Software Foundation, I follow what they do, where I can contribute on their GitHub discussions and whatnot. So again, I just think there's a myriad of different really passionate people who really want to move the needle. And the only way we're going to solve it is by partnering together.
Yeah, I love the Green Software Foundation work, and kudos to their great podcast, Environmental Variable. A great source of information in the field, definitely. And what about you, Niklas?
Well, I think there's a great value of sharing. This is something that we can share across industries, among companies within the same industries and so forth, because this is really a common journey for the planet. And so I would really encourage to get engaged with organizations like sustainableIT.org, where I'm part of the board, and we've seen great progress with a lot of companies joining in the last 18 months. There are others like CIO CO2 here in Sweden, and the Green Software Foundation as well is another one that sort of has propelling the purpose going forward. So look for case studies, look for other companies doing great things, and so far I've seen some amazing stories from some companies getting involved in sustainable IT, for example, and really inspiring to see the journey that they are taking, and taking a holistic approach, but also being very open in terms of the challenges that they have, or the challenges that we share. I would really like to direct you to sustainableIT.org and the IT standards and the environmental, ESG, social and governance standards that we have put out. So that's a great starting point. It's a free resource to get into and start pivoting. And it's a great complement if you're looking to create a strategy around this.
And I will put all these references in the show notes, obviously. Thanks a lot, both of you. And before we leave, I'd like to close now with a different question. So that will be my first. Could you share a piece of news which has made you optimistic about our path toward a more sustainable world, to close on a positive note?
It's not really a news story. Me being me, I like doing something that's technically outside a little bit of the box or outside the question. But I did a course a couple of months back called Leadership in Sustainable Business. And one of the key facilitators, Rachel Brown, she's been in the climate space pretty much all her life. She was even part of the first cohort of presenters for Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And she's also the founder of and CEO of the Sustainable Business Network in New Zealand. So, needless to say, she's a very impressive individual. And she actually told us that in her entire career, this is the most momentum that she's ever seen in the sustainability space. And that for me personally was incredibly uplifting, because I think we often see a lot of doom and gloom in the media, and the more aware you become, it can feel like the problem is just overwhelming. So just hearing someone who's a seasoned veteran, an expert, someone with a lot of clout, who said, well, actually, like, don't feel disheartened, look after yourselves. But, if you're feeling down and need a little pick me up, just remember this is the most momentum I've ever seen personally. And she's really optimistic for the future. So yeah, that's my little piece of good news.
And I really resonate with that as well. I think we've built up great momentum going forward. I think just in the last 12, 18 months, I've seen tremendous progress. We've had obviously some black swan events in recent years with COVID-19, but now also the war in Ukraine, and you see how countries in Europe is pivoting, for example, and the massive amount of creation of renewable energy in Europe at the moment is really, really staggering. And if we can solve some key issues, for example, where we can create renewable energy in Sahara Desert in Northern Africa, for example, and the transmission, then we have a great opportunity to drive down the carbon intensity quite quickly. So I think I'm very, very optimistic in terms of the momentum, the conversation. I also get a bit beaten down on the doom and gloom from the news and so forth at time to time, but then I try to reset myself and really look at the big picture and see all of the great things that's happening. especially in the US, for example, with the Reduction Act, the Great Infrastructure Reduction Act has also had great momentum in the US, and that's probably one of the most important legislations that has come across the hill in the last 10, 15 years. So really, really optimistic for the future.
Thanks a lot, both of you, for joining the show, sharing that much, which is something that you're used to when we see your track record when it comes to NGO involvement and then professional groups involvement. But still, very enjoyable to have you on the show, and looking forward to the comments from our listeners.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here, and really great discussion today.
Thank you for listening to this Green.io episode. In episode 25, we will talk about a massive announcement made by the W3C 2 weeks ago, which is the release of the draft version of its sustainability guidelines. 2 core members of the sustainability work group, nicknamed SustiWabe, will be with us to share insider information. Lucas Mastalert and Ines Akrap. They will highlight how these guidelines will impact the life of designers, project managers, web developers, and pretty much everyone working on the internet. Stay tuned. Before you leave, a small message from our sponsor. No, I'm kidding. Green.io is a free and independent podcast, and so we need your help to keep it that way. You can help us by supporting us on Tipeee. The link is in the episode note. I also give online and on-site conferences and facilitate workshops about climate change and digital sustainability, so do get in touch if that interests you. It's a good way to allow me to keep investing in the podcast. Full disclosure, each episode takes me roughly 15 hours of work, finding the guests, convincing them, researching the topic, etc., and it costs between 300 and 400 euro to produce. So now you've got all the figures. If you cannot donate, that's fine. You can support us by spreading the word. Rate the podcast 5 stars on Apple and Spotify. Ask a friend to do it too. Each vote is worth 1,000 likes on YouTube. Believe me. Sharing an episode on social media or directly with a relative is also more effective than many ads. Seriously, thanks for your support. It means a lot to us. Us being me, but also Tani Levitt, our amazing podcast producer, and Gilles Tellier, our amazing podcast curator. And stay tuned by subscribing to our Green.io monthly newsletter. The link in the episode notes, but you already know the drill. You will get carefully curated content, episode wrap-ups, and exclusive articles. It is as free and independent as the podcast itself, and it aims to help you, responsible technologists, build a greener digital world.
Waarom wij uit